Welcome to the PeakDay podcast, where we talk about fertility and natural family planning with our friends. Today's guest is Father Luke Barter. Father Luke is a Dominican friar from the province of St. Albert the Great. He met the Dominicans while he was studying at Purdue University and entered their novitiate in Denver in 2007. Father Luke was ordained in 2014 and is now the pastor at St. Dominic Parish in Denver. Along with his priestly vocation, Father Luke is a reader of history, sci-fi, fantasy, and science books. He avidly follows the Colorado Rapids MLS soccer team, and he enjoys playing the Congo drums and teaching salsa lessons at his parish. Welcome, Father Luke, to the PeakDay podcast.
Thanks, Martha. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Was there something in your childhood that planted the seed for your vocation to the priesthood?
I'm going to have to say yes to that question in some way, but in many ways, I found my vocation a bit of a surprise. At the same time, I can think back and think of those sort of spiritual influencers in my life, my grandmother in particular, my mother's mother, a deeply spiritual woman, a deeply well-read woman as well. But I never really had as a vocation or just really thought about the priesthood or religious life until I got to college. I grew up going to Catholic grade school, but I went to a public high school, went to a public university, as you mentioned. And it was when the idea of a priesthood vocation was presented to me through religious life. I didn't know that male religious kind of existed. It was sort of this, I had never been exposed. I had been exposed to sisters, but I had never been exposed to the male version. And it came like a sort of sudden surprise, a pleasant surprise. And it was really there. I always said that, growing up, God had my heart. I never had anything to be upset with the church about really, or have that negative experience. But it wasn't until college where I sort of say that God won my mind. And I had this just insatiable curiosity as I started asking questions and exploring what religion is. My freshman year was 2001, and my first semester was September 2001. And all of a sudden, religion was playing a different place in the world, playing a different role. And I was very interested in that because the consequences were not just about personal spirituality, but about world peace, economics, war, etc. And who is my neighbor?
Mm-hmm. So what specifically drew you to the Dominican order?
That I felt that they were real people. There was a great relatability with them. It was this tie of their personality, of the brothers, the specific brothers of the province, as well as this sort of 800-year tie, the habit, the intellectual tradition, but that they were brothers, and a kind of fraternity that wasn't just like we're associated with one another, that there was a deep, intimate fraternity. And I knew that in any sort of vocation, to be alone is not me. And I needed to have that fraternity. But then the brothers were the place where I was able to flower, and I found the best of myself.
Did you go looking for them, or did you meet them on campus or something?
I met them on campus. They were running the Newman Center, which ironically enough, or providentially enough, was where I was baptized as a baby. My dad was going to Purdue at the time, and I was baptized at that Newman Center before the Dominicans got there. And so I go back, and in the very church that I was baptized in, I meet the Dominicans and find my vocation.
Yeah, that's providential.
Right.
So you gave me an interesting fact that you did graduate studies in Islamic studies at the American University in Cairo,
Yes.
Egypt. What
Correct.
led you there? Is that just a normal part of Dominican studies, or was that a specialty you sought out?
Both, in one sense. So I had mentioned that, my freshman year was 9/11, and all of a sudden I grew in this academic interest in religion. I went to school for engineering, but ended up not finishing engineering and switching to philosophy and religious studies, and then worked when I graduated at the USCCB in the Secretary for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs as a staff assistant gopher, right? But it was very much formed. But throughout that whole entire time, the first decade of the 2000s, a lot of that question about what is Islam, et cetera, was coming up, and just being guided by the bishops, the theologians, and our dialogue partners. It just sort of was enmeshed in that, and it became a passion. And again, it was some noble cause that was much more than just an academic interest, but it had real effect on real people and a real dialogue. Right. And so when I entered the order, again, providentially, I didn't know this, but the order has since has had a community in Cairo for 100 years and runs the Dominican Institute for Oriental Studies, which is a research institute. It's not a school, it's a research institute, sort of at that super highfalutin academic level. We run a library, conferences, publish a journal, and they wanted to begin to form new people for this kind of work, and I was interested and was hooked. But to see my religious vocation as a Dominican married with sort of an academic and important aspect of how I was trying to come to understand the world around me, married in a single place, couldn't keep me away.
Have your Islamic studies had any kind of an impact now that you're a pastor? Have you used any of that, like in
Absolutely.
particular?
You know, and it's not just the Islamic studies, like the content of it. It's that whole experience of being in Cairo. I say that those 4 years were 4 of the most formative and the most difficult years of my life. And in the way that you find yourself overwhelmed with the reality of the world, for the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you can't sort of run away from it. I think we have this dependence, or we have a greater control over the good and the bad that comes in our life in very small and minimal ways. And we could be comfortable in expecting certain things to be certain ways, and all of that goes out the window. I learned a lot about myself, but I also learned sort of when you take yourself out of your own context, you realize where your limits are, where your context can blind you from certain other realities that are as true and as real, that need to be recognized. That about, for example, even just being Catholic, as a Catholic priest, as a Roman Catholic, I was a minority Catholic. Because the majority of the Catholics are the Coptic Catholics in Egypt. And of the Christians, we were still a minority because the Coptic Orthodox are the majority of the Christians. But when I would go into a Roman Catholic church, you're like, oh, this feels like home. Which a Coptic Catholic church, but it was as Catholic as the Roman Catholic Church. And even just this idea that Roman Catholicism isn't the center of the Catholic expression. And all of these assumptions, and sort of you find the beauties of the Roman tradition and what you love and what helps you identify culturally. But I learned to put that aside to experience the greater breadth of the Catholic Church. And how that interacted when Pope Francis visited in 2018, and to be able to be there for that. And then on top of what does being a minority feel like in a religious minority in a country? And that dynamic too was beautiful and eye-opening.
And so I imagine that you can identify even better with the parish, the people that you pastor at St. Dominic's.
So I feel like those 4 years in Egypt gave me a wisdom. I'm young. I can't claim to have wisdom as much as my elders, but that real lived experience about human nature, how to communicate, what influences people's actions, reactions, their desires, their fears, and learning those dynamics and having to navigate so many different kinds that I think it has made me a lot more of a compassionate and patient pastor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's helped me learn how to read beneath the line, beneath what's sort of on the surface, and
Okay.
understand these dynamics that are going on, because they were always on the surface 24/7 when I was there.
So, what has been like one of the biggest challenges of, taking on a parish and becoming a pastor?
Oof. And the thing is, I've had it easy,
Well,
because I was a vicar here before, so I kind of like knew the people.
sure.
I didn't get a parish with debt, with big problems, kind of
Mm,
like that. Of all the things, I didn't have a lot of that big learning curve that many do.
okay.
So I'm really grateful. This community still calls me a baby priest because they've known me since, a wee one, a wee priest.
Right. Right.
Uh, I think the hardest thing is knowing how to distinguish between loving the people and guiding them as a father, sometimes having to bring them along for, as I try to pray and discern as best I can, where I believe the Lord is calling them in the church today,
Mm,
and not getting in the way of that.
mm-hmm.
You know, it's overwhelming sometimes to, when you feel like, Lord, don't let me screw this up. Don't let me screw this up.
Oh,
And to learn how to listen and to make sure that I know how to distinguish what's of me, what's of them, and then what's of God.
so what would be one of your biggest blessings so far of being a pastor?
The people.
Mm,
It's all about the people.
mm,
And when we are praying together,
mm,
those Sunday liturgies, when the people gather and you can feel the joy, the community, but when we're silent, like during the penitential act, for example, we take that silence before we just jump in, let us
mm-hmm.
call to mind our sins. Everybody's silent and praying together.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is singing together like that. We're praying together, and you feel spirit filled.
Hmm. So you're preparing couples for marriage. You mentioned about 50 couples per year you prepare
Uh-huh.
for marriage.
Yep.
So I imagine they kind of come from a variety of backgrounds.
Yep.
So have you made any observations or do you see any trends with couples, like in regards to, living chastely, maybe knowing or learning the theology of the body and natural family planning?
So let me answer this in just a couple parts.
Sure.
A theology of the body is part of our marriage prep program.
Okay.
And so I have a very intentional marriage prep program. It's
Okay.
interesting that there's no real standard. There's certain things that you need to have, but every parish sort of does it differently. Do you
Mm-hmm.
do a weekend retreat? Do you pair them with another couple? Is it like, how long do you do it, et cetera? And what's the engagement of a priest? As a Dominican and that charism, I see marriage prep as our number one faith formation program,
Mm,
right? And it's
okay.
the one because it's one of the most active. And
Sure.
the one-on-ones going through the different courses, but through their context as young adults, most of them are young adults, not all of them, um, allows me to introduce these ideas and topics and bring them through it in a different way. Um, I think my generation and after carries a lot of baggage
Hmm.
with things regarding the church. And here's the way I've been trying to describe it for myself and others,
Mm-hmm.
is that there's a difference between the Catholic faith and Catholic culture. And what is of the culture is not necessarily essential of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my experiences outside of the United States and the American Catholic Church, even experiencing like the European Roman Catholic Church, but sometimes I think there's a way in which we don't understand that some of our assumptions about what it means to be a Roman Catholic is universal, and it's not. And what are our experiences of the Roman Catholic Church growing up in for the 80s and 90s, and what was our formation like? What are some of the narratives, the vocabulary? And it's not easily mappable across the world. And that it is very particular. And I think coming back and it was sort of glaring to me. And I think this baggage affects their willingness to listen to the church. Because certain vocabulary, symbols, words, phraseology, even ideas about rules and regulations and all that sort of stuff, they don't want to hear it. But because it comes with a way and they received it as a kid that didn't give them a reason to want to know why. Why do I have to do this? We never gave them the why. We just told them that they had to. And if not, it was a really bad thing. Without any of that understanding. And so the approach for me when it comes to meeting most of these couples is trying to introduce them to that why and give them a reason why they might want to. Why is it in their benefit? But having to use a completely different vocabulary. And really try, and a lot of it is based on a trust and a connection that you have to make with them. And partly you have to share your own story as well. And so I think then with living chastely, at least in my context, so we have a large young adult population in my parish, but we're an urban parish. We're not your typical suburban parish. So there's a lot of transiency, right? But I have this demographic of young people, they're just out of college or they're young, they're either dating or just got engaged and they haven't had kids yet, right? And many of them are marrying non-Catholics, right? You get those who, if they even come to the church and want to get married in the church, like you get people who are doing it because of mom and grandma, but there's a part of them that does want it. There are people who have not been catechized well. They still identify as Catholic and want the Catholic part to be important, but they just don't know anything and they're not regularly practicing. But then you get those young adults who have truly owned the faith for their own and they're all in. But those are less.
Sure.
And I would say the vast majority of my couples are cohabitating already.
You mentioned, that there's no uniformity in marriage prep programs. Have you just kind of developed one on your own? Did you inherit one? What is your marriage prep program like?
I developed one on my own, partly because I'm not sure I really trust a lot of sort of the more institutionalized programming that's out there.
Okay.
So I went through some materials, watched some videos. I even had like certain couples. This was suggested to me, showed it to them. What do you think? How does this hit you?
Right.
And as I would show some of these things that would be suggested, because the content is great, right? The content is what the church teaches.
Sure.
But the way it's presented, they're just like, no, don't show that to anybody. Right. And it goes back to that thing of language, vocabulary, turns of phrase, but also I feel like a lot of them, this imposition of if you want to be a good person, you have to look this way and sound this way and talk this way. And they don't identify with some of that Catholic culture, right? There can be a culture around certain things, and to learn how to distinguish the content from the culture and maybe present the content without watering it down, but present it in a way that meets them where they're at. And a lot of the programming out there, I found that couples don't find it helpful. And so started developing my own classes. And there's sort of this way of integrating it too in the marriage prep. How I present what is marriage prep is a very, very important part of their receptivity for everything else. Is why are they there? And to invite them to a buy-in. And once you get them to buy in to what you're offering, what I give them is more easily received as well.
Can you give me an example of what that sounds like? Or maybe, what has been, institutionally presented versus what is more practical? Can you give me examples of that?
So a lot of people come in marriage prep experiences, or they've heard from their sister's marriage prep experience or brothers, or even some of their parents' marriage prep experience that, the church needs to teach you these classes and they need to, approve that you need to get married and that you can, and then you need to make sure that you're not having sex before marriage, and that there's this, and we just need to make sure you're taught, right? That's often what I sort of they're waiting for. Not everybody, but often.
Okay.
And that these are hoops that I have to go through if I want to get married in the church.
Sure.
And that part, they're like already busy with planning the party.
Right.
And having to do this. How do you make this not feel like a chore?
Yeah.
Or like your religious education back when you were a kid, where you had to be dropped off and you need to go to Sunday school or had to go to CCD or RE or whatever.
Right.
It feels a lot like that again, and that there is this rule, right?
Right.
That's sort of what they're coming with. I present this in this way. I say, marriage prep is about preparing you for marriage. We are worried about everything after the day, right? Exactly. And we want to give you as many tools and experiences as possible so that you can thrive in your marriage.
Right.
And I present to them their engagement this way. I said, when I was ordained a deacon, the best bit of advice I got at the reception after my ordination was from a priest. And he said, be a deacon. He says, don't be a pre-priest. He's like, you're not a layperson anymore.
Right.
But you're not a priest yet. And your diaconate year has so many unique graces, experiences, and features that you will never get again in your life. So milk it for all it's worth.
Okay.
And I say, you're not dating anymore, but you're not married yet. And your engagement is this new way of understanding your relationship. And there are so many ways that you now, because you have a commitment in a particular way and striving for something, that you might be able to have conversations you've never had before. And we want to help guide and maybe give you some experiences of conversations you never thought to have, to go deeper into the ones and learn how to communicate and grow in true intimacy and not just in a warm, fuzzy feeling of love. But what does it look like to be intimate?
Right.
And then I bring out the four intimacies of, if we believe this is theology of the body, if we believe that we're a body and a soul, right? And marriage is a total gift of oneself. If you really want to give your whole self to someone else and you're intending that, you kind of have to know what you're giving to and what is that self.
Right.
And there's a physical aspect, there's an emotional, an intellectual, and a spiritual. So what does it mean to be spiritually intimate? What does it mean to be emotionally intimate, et cetera? And do you even know what that means, right? And I say, do you know how your intended prays? You may know that they pray, but do you know how they pray? Besides, hands like this or sitting silent. And they're like, I have no idea. I'm like, that's 1/4 of the person you want to give your life to. That you have zero, it's uncharted territory.
Right.
How do you have those conversations? How do you start? And so that's sort of the way I say, hiring us, like when you join our program, it's like hiring a personal trainer, right? You decide to prioritize something in your life, an aspect, and you're going to devote time and resources to it. And with a personal trainer butts into your life.
Right.
right? You give them permission to butt in and make your life inconvenient because you're prioritizing this.
Exactly.
What we do is we want to butt into your life in your engagement, that through the entire process of you preparing for the wedding day and the party, and we know how crazy that can be and the stresses, that you are stopping in the middle of your engagement, and we're going to butt in and inject ourselves throughout the entire process to make sure that you guys are working on each other. Right. And growing and reminding each other about what you're doing this for, and that make that as important as the party. Right. And so I say that we stretch out our program to be a part of your engagement, and like to work with you and to milk your engagement for all it's worth, not for you just to have classes. So when I introduce NFP, because in this archdiocese, NFP is a requirement. And it's not a requirement in many archdioceses, but it's a requirement here. And you can read on the faces and in the voices when you hear, so I ask them, when you hear NFP, natural family planning, what comes to mind? Right. And you get your typical answers. It's about not using contraception, have a lot of babies, and that's their thing. And I said, okay, I said, it's a lot more than that. Yeah. And the way I try to sell them first, to maybe give them a way to be receptive to what NFP offers, is to say it like this. I says, okay, we talk about these 4 intimacies, right? We can talk about physical intimacy. Physical intimacy isn't just around sexuality, isn't just about romance. There's a different kind of physical intimacy of being vulnerable with the other in your body and learning how to be cared for and respected, and learning how to respect and care for the other in their body, and experience a kind of physical intimacy that probably you guys have not had yet. I say, God forbid one of you gets sick. But how have you had the kind of experience of each other's bodies? And I say NFP allows you to have an experience about learning how to communicate about your body, and in a way that isn't around sexuality, but is about what does it mean to be in my body and to care for someone when it's not your body. How do you talk to them, communicate, and how do you allow someone to communicate to you, or how do you let them in or not? And I said NFP is an opportunity for you guys to, in some small way, begin to practice a kind of dialogue around physical intimacy that isn't just about sex. Right. And to learn how to do that. And I say, so I say, do you only get out of marriage prep as much as you put in? And most of marriage prep happens at home. I say, so be intentional about doing this. You're going to have to do some charting, and she's going to have to take her temperature, etc. I'm like, don't make this about her having to take the data down. That's not helpful, right? If she gets up, you get up. And actually be conscious about this dialogue. How do you ask questions about her body? How does she allow herself to be cared for? And maybe, just maybe, in this understanding of caring for the other in the body, maybe it means you can't touch each other romantically for whatever reason. I use an example of a couple. 2 months before the wedding, he got a major concussion and began to live with chronic pain, at the wedding, 6 months into the wedding. Young couple. Her love language is touch, right? But when he was in the height of his pain, she needed to abstain from hugging him or touching him, which was hard on her, but she also needed him to let her in. And they were able to use some of these tools that they learned to learn how to dialogue and realize it's coming in a different context. Right. But that physical intimacy, and to build it on something much more holistic, is the way I present it. And that doing this, and even the practice of NFP, prioritizes communication over convenience. Absolutely. And that communication is the thing that's going to make the strength of a base of a relationship survive and thrive. Right. And that's what you want to look for. And then through that communication, to understand the beauty and put that together with theology of the body. But it also is about a thriving relationship, a relationship is better if it's based on communication and not on convenience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, it sounds like you talk to a lot of couples every year about, preparation for marriage. What positive things have you seen after, going through the process? Have you seen changes of heart? What's your experience?
Yeah. So for marriage prep, in a total yes, I see a lot more buy-in. I see people like more freely and more deeply desiring to do marriage,
Mm,
right? There are people that are overwhelmed by the reality of it. They're like, I really didn't understand that.
mm-hmm,
And there's great gratitude, but there's also a deeper desire to actually do it,
mm,
right?
right.
Because they see and they've experienced the change in their relationship by milking
Mm-hmm.
their engagement for what it's worth,
Right, right. Making the most of it. Absolutely. Right.
right? The easy option is contraception. The easy
Sure.
option is a convenient sexuality, but that they don't have to be afraid about what this is or automatically dismiss it because
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
a sense of social, cultural, moral debates, etc.
Right, right.
Um, and I think that's invaluable. That they're actually understanding their context and their self
Mm,
anew, and that's why I call marriage prep my number one faith formation program,
yeah,
because marriage prep is a vehicle to reintroduce many of these couples to the faith
right. Exactly.
and to represent what Catholicism is, what we teach in a way that's not, they're not kids anymore. And many of them haven't touched it
Mm-mm.
or only touched it mass once in a while. Never have dug on, have never thought their faith through as an adult,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and never have been given the opportunity to ask questions, to understand the why, or to own it for themselves.
Mm,
And I see, as a Dominican order of preachers, our mission is the preaching of the gospel to anyone, anywhere, to be that bridge between the two.
mm-hmm.
And I have this one-on-one experience of what is a sacrament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who is God? What's the Trinity? Right? All of these things sort of come up. And why is marriage a sacrament? But it hits its catechesis 101.
Right.
And to see them try to come alive and then have practical experiences.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there has to be that integration. And so I want them to have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, that requirement is says that this is invaluable.
Right. Well, thank you, Father Luke, for being on the PeakDay podcast. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry about rambling. It was my privilege, really.